Welcome back for part 2 of my At the Cross short story series. Today we are jumping ahead to the morning of Jesus' crucifixion. Simon of Cyrene and his family are traveling to Jerusalem, arriving there for the feast of Passover, or Pesach as they say in Hebrew. And hopefully I didn't just butcher that pronunciation. I tried. When I first started writing this part of the story, I wasn't really sure what direction I wanted to take it, since unlike with Peter's story, I only had one scripture about Simon in 3 of the 4 Gospels, and they all said pretty much the same thing, almost word for word, just slight differences. So a lot of it I had to just come up with on my own. So I started doing some research into who Simon of Cyrene was, what we know about him, where he was, really from, who his family was, and all that kind of stuff. And I learned a few very interesting things. First of all, Cyrene was located in what is now modern-day Libya. And so many believe that Simon was actually an African man that had been adopted into the Jewish faith. He had taken it as his own faith, and so he wasn't just a regular Jew, ethnically. And I thought that was such a cool fact, because it's just another example of how Jesus has always included anyone and everyone, no matter their background or their nationality, into his story, and especially important moments in history throughout the Bible. Also, I discovered that in the book of Mark, it specifically mentions Simon's sons' names, Rufus and Alexander. And now if the Bible mentions somebody by name, there's a good chance that it was for a specific reason. And in my research, I discovered that many scholars believe that the reason why he was mentioned here is because Rufus is also the Rufus mentioned later in the New Testament by the Apostle Paul, meaning he could have been an important member of the early church and was somebody that, him and his family, that the early church was familiar with. So that, is an interesting thought. Most interesting of all was the fact that Simon carrying Jesus' cross actually had some pretty big consequences that you probably wouldn't think of. I know I had never considered anything like this before. You see, according to the law, Jews had to be ritually pure in order to participate in Passover or any other feast day or anything to do with the temple in general. And by Simon touching the unclean cross that was at this time probably already streaked with Jesus' blood, he would have been considered unclean. So that means Simon probably didn't get to participate in Passover that year. And according to what I read, it was just over a month's journey, 32 days worth of travel between Cyrene and Jerusalem. So he and his family traveled for a long time to come and be a part of this important day. And then all of that would have been taken from him by carrying Jesus' cross. But little did Simon know that that blood that, according to the law, would have made him unclean, actually had the power to make him purer than any ritualistic sacrifice or anything ever could. And it was actually the blood of the ultimate Passover lamb. "32 days of travel, sleeping at inns and on hillsides, battling weather and the threat of bandits, had come down to this, a mere 300 cubits between Simon of Cyrene and Jerusalem. The morning sun shone weak and gray through heavy clouds, casting the buildings climbing up Mount Zion into shadow. With every step, a strange unease settled over Simon. Something about the day seemed heavy, foreboding, like the threat of a storm being carried on a breeze. I can help kill the Pesach lamb this year, right? His youngest son, Rufus, walked next to him, his gangly limbs working hard to keep up with Simon's longer stride. You promised me last year that when I turned 12 I could help you and Alexander. Simon reached out a dark-skinned hand to scrub at his son's unruly curls. Yes, my son, you can help me and your brother this year. The doomed lamb, being led on a rope by his wife, Rona, chose that moment to bleat, happily unaware that its life was drawing to a close. As the Essene gate of Jerusalem loomed before them, Simon surveyed his travel-worn family. Rona led their Passover lamb, her lovely black curls modestly covered by a shawl the color of rich clay. 14-year-old Alexander pulled the small cart bearing what remained of their provisions for the month-long journey, and young Rufus, strolling at Simon's side, hummed a merry tune. With a sigh, Simon looped an arm around Rufus's shoulders. Yahweh has been good to us, my son. I am thankful for another year to gather in his city for this sacred day. But even as he said the words, that unsettled feeling returned. Something about this trip to Jerusalem felt different. Moments later, they entered the city alongside a small group of fellow travelers. At first, everything seemed to be as it had always been for every pilgrimage he'd made. Wives and mothers rushed around in their preparations for Pesach. Children played in the streets, and weary travelers settled into their rented rooms. But the further up the mountain they climbed, the tighter the streets became, and the tighter the unease clenched around Simon's heart. With each new block of homes, more bodies pressed in until it was almost impossible to keep walking. And this wasn't the usual congestion one would expect from a city swollen with thousands of visitors from all across the known world. These people were shouting, pushing, shoving, rioting. "Crucify him!" a shrill voice screeched. Simon flinched. He had yet to see the awful form of execution in action, but he'd heard enough descriptions of the practice to turn his stomach with dread. An elbow jabbed hard into Simon's side, and he stumbled into a man's back. "My apologies," he said, though in this den of chaos who knew if the man heard him. "Alexander!" Simon shouted over his shoulder. "Stay close to your mother. Do not let her get lost in this crowd." He reached back and found Rufus's thin arm. "Hold on to my tunic, son, and do not let go." Simon forced his way through the throbbing mass of sweat-soaked bodies. They were only a few streets away from the inn they usually stayed in when sojourning in Jerusalem. If he could just keep moving. "Crucify him! Crucify him!" The demand swelled louder, ringing in Simon's ears. He shoved past another person and found himself at a crossroads between two streets. Here the crush of people lined the path instead of filling it. Every head faced east, focused on someone or something coming down the street. "All hail the King of the Jews!" a sarcastic voice shouted. The crack of a whip rang out, followed by the unmistakable slap of leather bands against skin. "Simon, what is happening?" Rona's hand touched his shoulder. "Stay back, my love." A procession was coming down the road. The forms of several Roman soldiers came into focus, their golden helmets gleaming in the morning sun. One walked at the head of the procession, his sword held at the ready. Not far behind him, another followed, the whip Simon had heard held firm in his right hand. Between the first two soldiers, a thick wooden beam bobbed up and down, and as the Romans neared, Simon realized it rested on the shoulders of a man. Simon's stomach clenched as he took in the man's horrific appearance. Clearly he had received more than just the one lashing. He'd been brutally beaten to what could only be the edge of death itself. The back of his garment was soaked through with blood from the lashes undoubtedly crisscrossing his back. A crown of what looked like thorns had been driven into his head, some sort of cruel mockery to accompany the sarcastic claim that this was the King of the Jews. Blood streaked the man's face, matting his dark hair and beard, and one eye was swollen almost completely shut. Simon sucked in a breath. What sort of crime had this man committed to be worthy of such an end? "Blasphemy! Curse this blasphemer!" The crowd provided the answer to his question. Simon stiffened. Such a crime was worthy of death according to the law. But why did the claim not sit well with him? It made no sense. He knew nothing of the man before him outside of this moment. How could Simon know he wasn't worthy of this death? Behind the first two soldiers and the man carrying the beam that would make up part of his cross were several other soldiers and two more criminals, but something kept drawing Simon's eye back to the first man. It was something about the way he carried the crossbeam, the quiet anguish evident in every line of his broken body. Every muscle was taut with pain, but he did not scream or even raise his voice. Who was this man? Jesus! A woman's shriek brought Simon's eyes up to the crowd lining the opposite edge of the street. A middle-aged woman pushed against the arm of a young man attempting to block her from the path. Jesus, no! My son! My son! She covered her face with her hands and wailed. Her mournful cry raised every hair on Simon's arms despite the warmth of the day. The condemned man, Jesus apparently, looked up at his mother and stumbled, collapsing to one knee. Get up! The soldier behind him slung the whip through the air. The 9 tails embedded with pieces of metal and stones slapped across Jesus' back. His mother screamed again, pushing harder against the man holding her back. A young woman wrapped an arm around the grieving woman's shoulders and said something close in her ear. Whatever it was seemed to calm her, because she turned her face into her companion's shoulder and muted her sobs. On your feet, you dog! Again the whip cracked against Jesus' torn skin. Then again, 2, 3, 4 times. At the 4th blow, Jesus fell flat on his face, the thick beam clattering on top of him. He groaned, drops of blood splattering onto the dirt. I said, get up! Instinctively, Simon reached out a hand to help the man. But what good could he really do? You, African! The lead soldier pointed his blade at Simon. Me, sir? Simon put a hand to his chest. Grab him. The soldier gestured to his companion and then pointed at Simon once more. If he has not the strength to carry his own cross, then this man will do it for him, seeing as he looks so sorry for him. The second soldier came forward, reaching out to snag Simon's arm and jerk him into the street. No! Simon! Rona screamed, reaching for him. Father, don't let them take you! Rufus cried, losing his once firm hold on Simon's tunic. Stay back! Simon raised a hand to stop his family. All will be well. Boys, stay with your mother and the lamb. Stay together. I will find you. Hurry up! The soldier gripping Simon's forearm slung him forward. The momentum sent Simon's body ahead of his feet, and he tumbled to his knees, catching his weight with his hands. Mere inches from the man, Jesus. Simon lifted his head and found himself staring into Jesus' face. The blood and gore was so much worse up close. The brightest crimson coated nearly every inch of him, it seemed. But somehow, Simon didn't feel the need to shrink away from it. The unease that had been squeezing tight around his heart loosened and let go. In its place was a strange, hair-raising sensation that he could neither name nor explain. Jesus looked straight into Simon's eyes. That gaze. Why did it feel like the man could see beyond the outward appearance and down into something far deeper? The sheen of tears appeared in Jesus' eyes, and the side of his mouth curved up the slightest fraction. Yahweh bless you and your family, Simon of Cyrene. Simon gasped and jerked upright. The man knew his name. How did he know his name? Get up! We have wasted enough time already. Hard Roman hands gripped Simon's garment and pulled him to his feet. Take the beam from him and carry it the rest of the way. Lightning seemed to course along Simon's limbs. Impossibly, this stranger, a man convicted of blasphemy, knew his name. Yes, he could have heard Rona scream his name as he was dragged into the street, but how could he know where he was from? This was no ordinary man. This was... He didn't know who Jesus was, but something of Yahweh was in this moment without a doubt. Simon started to reach for the thick beam still pressing down on Jesus' back, but he paused just short of touching it. By touching such an instrument of death, already spattered with the blood of the man whose hands would soon be nailed to it, Simon would be deemed temporarily unclean, unable to touch his wife, hug his sons, unable to participate in the feast of Pesach. A month he had traveled to the city to keep the law of Moses, and with one touch, that law would be broken. Yahweh bless you and your family, Simon of Cyrene. Something told him that the sacrifice would be worth it. Stooping low, Simon lifted the beam from off Jesus' back. With a grunt, he hefted it onto his shoulders and took a staggering step forward. Behind him, the Roman soldiers forced Jesus back onto his feet and prodded him along. The crowd roared with renewed vigor, calling down all manner of curses upon the trio of men sentenced to die. But with every step down the narrow path between the screaming throngs, the chaos faded, until Simon barely noticed anything but the burden he carried. Tears welled in his eyes, thicker and hotter with every moment. Splinters of wood dug into his palms, and the tangy scent of blood pricked his nose. The crimson streaks left behind by Jesus' hands coated his own. My Lord and my God! Simon felt the inexplicable urge to pray, but no other words would come. My Lord and my God! At last, the hill of Golgotha loomed before their procession. Near its crest, Simon's tears grew so thick he couldn't see where to take his next step. He began to stumble, but a hand stayed him. Here was far enough. It was the lead soldier, the one who had selected him from the crowd. Drop the beam. We will take over from here. Simon nodded and lowered the beam to the dirt. Every muscle trembled from both exertion and the surprising emotions overwhelming him. What had he just done? It felt so significant, and yet he didn't understand why. Simon caught one last glimpse of Jesus before he turned away and lowered himself to his knees. Completely overcome, he stared at Jesus' blood streaking his palms and wept. Yahweh bless you and your family, Simon of Cyrene. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed Simon's story of his encounter with Jesus, and I hope you'll tune in tomorrow for part 3, which will go into the mind of the soldier overseeing Jesus' crucifixion. Thank you and have a great day.